Good afternoon, everybody. The last part of the unit that I want to talk about are the different types of societies. And the first block of societies that we're going to talk about are the ones before industrialization. So before mechanization, machines, and urbanization when people moved to the cities. And the first type of society that we're going to focus on is the one that I think you read about in the article, hunter-gatherer societies. They are not all gone. There are still some hunter-gatherer societies left, but they're really dwindling. Um, and we're going to talk about a couple other types as well. What I want to do is, because I played this in the other class and I like this, the crash course on societies, the host, she does a really good job of focusing in on some issues, and right at the top of the list is inequalities in society. It's an interesting way to look at these different types of societies. Like, where do we go from a society that's pretty much everybody is equal to ones where there are big inequalities between different groups in society? So she outlines that and talks about the theory behind what causes that. And so I'm going to play it. I might pause it a couple times and talk about it, and then we're going to go through the pre-industrial societies after that. And I do have one question on the formative that deals with this issue of inequality. So make sure you listen to some of the things that she has to say.
Your life is your business, not ours. With Firefox,
Obviously, after our little commercial here.
own your life. Firefox fights for you.
Until about 12,000 years ago, the largest group of people ever assembled, the most humans ever gathered in one place, was probably a crowd of about 100, tops. And there were somewhere between 1 and 10 million people on the entire planet back then. Today, we have football stadiums that can fit 100 people 1,000 times over. The city of Shanghai has a population of over 24 million, and there are almost 7.5 billion people on Earth. How the heck did we get from there to here? That might sound like a history question, and it is, partly. But it's also a sociology question. Because if we want to understand how we got from small groups huddled around a fire to cities of millions, we need to understand what society is and how societies change as their populations grow. And we need to understand how different kinds of society shape the people who live in them. Pretty much any question you can ask about society, you can answer with the help of sociology. As long as there have been humans, there have been societies. We're social animals, and even when there were mere handfuls of us, we grouped together, forming the first societies. Now, society can mean lots of different things. A few families who spend all their time hunting deer and picking mushrooms can be a society, but so are the 70 million people of the Roman Empire, and so are the 1.2 billion people living in India today. So we need a definition that's going to include all of these things, and conveniently enough, we have one. A society is simply a group of people who share a culture and a territory. That's a good definition, but it doesn't really tell us much about the different kinds of societies or how we get from one kind to another. For that, we turn to the work of American sociologist Gerhard Lenski. Lenski focused on technology as the main source of societal change through a process he called sociocultural evolution, the changes that occur as a society gains new technology. Lenski then broke up human history into 5 different types of societies, defined by the technology they used and the social organizations that the technology helped create and sustain. If you look back to early human history, say about 30 to 40,000 years ago, you find a lot of what Lenski called hunting and gathering societies. In these societies, people made use of extremely basic tools to help them hunt animals and gather wild plants for food. Now, if you think about how much you eat in a day and imagine trying to gather up that much food every day, it should be pretty clear that this is no easy task. So food was the major concern in these societies, and they still exist today. People in hunting and gathering societies spend almost all their time trying to make sure they have enough food, and they're nomadic, following migrating animals and wild harvests, so they don't build permanent settlements. So by their very nature, these societies tend to be small. Hunting and gathering can't support a group of more than 25 to 40 people effectively. And in order for hunting and gathering to support even that, everyone has to work to find food, and everyone has to share their resources in order to ensure the survival of the group. This means that these societies have very low inequality. For the vast majority of human history, every single person lived in hunting and gathering societies, up until about 12,000 years ago when the domestication of plants and animals led to new kinds of society. horticultural and pastoral societies. Pastoral societies are based around the domestication of animals and are also nomadic, moving from place to place to keep their herds fed. Horticultural societies, on the other hand, are based on cultivating plants. So with horticultural societies, we see the first human settlements as groups began to stay put to remain close to reliable sources of food. And we also see for the first time the accumulation of material surplus, that is, more resources than are needed to feed the population. This is incredibly important because having a surplus allows a society to grow. And it also means that not everyone needs to work on getting food and simply surviving. This, in turn, leads to the first real instances of specialization in society, with separate political, religious, and military roles coming about. We also get real social inequality for the first time. And this same dynamic accelerates as we move into agrarian society, as permanent settlements emerge based around agricultural production. Starting about 5,000 years ago, with better farming techniques like the animal-drawn plow, we get more food production and an even bigger material surplus. From this came larger populations and larger settlements, with even more specialization and even more inequality. Remember serfs and nobles? Feudalism was an agrarian society. And you know what else happens when societies reach this point? The family starts to become less important. In other kinds of societies, things like education are handled almost entirely by the family. But as societies grow and become more complex, those functions start to be taken up by larger social institutions like the church or schools. And now we finally start approaching present-day America with industrial societies. These societies get their start with the Industrial Revolution around 1750, as production began to shift from human and animal power to machine power. This had a massive impact on food production, with new technologies like the tractor and the combine producing huge surpluses that could support even larger populations with even more specialization. But the Industrial Revolution also marked a fundamental change in the organization of society itself. Societies far larger than anything seen before meant a greater need to assert centralized control over everything, from the production of goods to transportation to agricultural production, in order to keep things running smoothly. For the first time, human society moved away from a subsistence-based economy. As mass production became possible, a capital-based economy emerged. As the surplus grew and specialization increased, so did inequality, with factory workers spending 12-hour days on one end and incredibly wealthy captains of industry making enormous profits on the other. It's no coincidence that soon after the Industrial Revolution, Marxism and conflict theory emerged. And the decreasing importance of the family continued as well, as more institutions stepped into traditional family roles. Industrial societies were the first to have universal public education, for instance, and for the first time, the majority of healthcare and caregiving were institutionalized, done outside the home in hospitals. The need to keep production organized also meant an increasingly urbanized population, because it's easier to control the resources you need if they're centralized. So people moved from the countryside to urban centers where the industrial jobs were. And all of this keeps going in Lenski's scheme of things, with specialization and technological innovation continuing until the development of the computer, a technology that gave rise to the post-industrial society. In post-industrial societies, we still see specialization, increased urbanization, and technological advances. But the defining change is that post-industrial societies shift away from an economy based on raw materials and manufacturing to an economy based on information, services, and technology. This is how we got here. If you look at the most dynamic sectors of the US economy, you see massive wealth being created in tech, finance, and service industries, but a steady decline in manufacturing. That said, it's not as though Americans don't buy stuff. Apps can do a lot of things, but they can't yet conjure a car out of the ether for you. So this is a good chance to point out that these different types of society aren't isolated from each other. You can't have a post-industrial society without having industrial societies elsewhere to supply it with goods. This points again to increasing inequality, not just within one society, but across societies. So in Lenski's understanding, societal change is driven by technological change. But it's worth pointing out that not all of these changes are beneficial. Pollution, global warming, and large-scale warfare are new problems that technology has brought us. And technology doesn't solve fundamental societal problems. It has the potential to reorganize society, but technology can't tell us how to have peaceful or just societies. In fact, just looking at Lenski's classifications, you can see that advancing technology also advances inequality in society, making it increasingly unequal. So we can't limit our discussion of society to just looking at technology. But that's okay, because the sociocultural changes that Lenski talks about can also be understood using the work of some old friends, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. Marx, for example, might seem pretty similar to Lenski at first. If you think back to his theory of historical materialism, he certainly seems to put a strong focus on technology and the economy as the driving forces of history. Remember, he saw that changes in the forces of production are important in pushing the change from one mode of production to another. But for Marx, you only get large-scale social change through class struggle, which culminates in a revolution, overthrowing the old relations of production, and replacing them with an entirely new set. So in Marx's view, the transition between Lenski's stages requires technological change, but it also requires revolution. And we can also use Marx's understanding of conflict to compare Lenski's stages with each other. In hunting and gathering societies, for example, conflict and inequality are leveled by the lack of surplus and the need to share resources, but that's not the case in post-industrial society. Max Weber, for his part, seems further away from Lenski than Marx, focusing not on technology or revolution, but on ideas. The major transition that Weber talked about was the shift from traditional to modern society, which he argued was really a matter of rationalization. Now, it's not that Weber didn't appreciate the importance of technology, but he argued that the transition from agrarian to industrial society, for instance, began with a shift in ideas, like new techniques in accounting and ways of approaching social organization. And it was these ideas, combined with advances in technology, that produced the overall change. So in this view, both ideas and technology were crucial for the emergence of modern capitalism. And Durkheim finally took a different tack from either Marx or Weber. He approached the transitions that Lenski talked about from the perspective of a society's underlying social structure. Specifically, Durkheim saw the history of society as a long-term change in solidarity, a change in what held societies together. He argued that hunting and gathering societies were held together by similarity, what he called mechanical solidarity. Durkheim argued that everyone in these societies had the same skills and lived in basically the same way, but that changed as society developed and specialization increased. With more specialization, people became more differentiated, taking on different jobs, learning different skills, and living in different ways. But Durkheim argued people also became more tightly integrated because they became more interdependent. Factory workers needed farmers to make food so that they could eat, and farmers needed factory workers to make their tools and other goods. Durkheim called this interdependence organic solidarity. And so Lenski's sociocultural evolution is, for Durkheim, the story of a long transition from mechanical to organic solidarity. Ultimately, all of these ways of looking at society and its changes from the point of view of technology, or conflict and revolution, or ideas, or underlying social structure are important for understanding what society is and how it works. Each one of these perspectives sees things that the others miss, and each one is important for the discipline of sociology. Today we learned about the society, what it is, and how it changes. We talked about Gerhard Lenski's classification of societies into 5 types, and the technological changes that turn one into another. We returned to Marx and Weber and talked about how they understood societal change. And we also talked about Durkheim's understanding of society and how social solidarity can be mechanical or organic. Crash Course Sociology is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio in Missouri.
Okay. So, and one thing, so she's talking about the different types of societies, and she's talking about how they change into other types of societies. Again, remember that we have some societies, still hunter-gatherers, that haven't changed into agricultural societies, for example. So the definition we have here is pretty similar to what she had. Society, what we're talking about is people with who share a common culture and live within defined territorial boundaries. And we'll look at 6 different types of societies. So we'll look at the way that society provides for basic needs. That's going to be a key in differentiating the different society types. How their social structures are different. And we're going to look at pre-industrial, industrial, and post-industrial societies. And so let's start talking about hunter-gatherers. So with hunter-gatherer societies, this is where people provide by, this is where people survive by hunting animals and gathering edible plants to consume. So for most of these societies, they ran from about 2 million years ago to about 10,000 years ago. But again, there are still hunter-gatherer societies that are with us today. For these to work, you had to have a small population. So we're talking about societies that had less than 50 people. And it should be obvious in some ways why. You know, if you had a community, if you had a city of, let's say, 2,000 people, it's just not feasible to survive by hunting and gathering. But it does work if you have a small population. There's no government in hunter-gatherer societies, so the family is the only institution beyond the group itself. But in hunter-gatherer societies, this is a key point, the group even the group comes before the family. So group needs are at the top. People share everything, and there really aren't any divisions in classes of people. So everybody is basically the same status in hunter-gatherer societies. So their values reflect this. So in hunter-gatherer societies, values like generosity and hospitality are right at the top because they're communal, they share everything. And there isn't much division of labor, but there is a limited degree in terms of age and gender. So if you in a hunter-gatherer society, if you have very elderly people, they're probably not going to be the ones out on the hunt for animals, for example. And one thing I should mention too, and this probably came up in discussion as well, just because a hunter-gatherer society is less technologically advanced, certainly not as advanced as a post-industrial society like ours where, computers dominate, that doesn't mean in other areas they might not be more advanced. So think about like the values that they have: generosity, hospitality. In some ways, I think many people would say hunter-gatherer societies are more advanced, more sophisticated, maybe in the non-material culture in terms of values. So just keep that in mind. Okay, the next type of society is horticultural, and this is all based around the growing of plants. Now, systematic agriculture isn't there in a horticultural society where they've domesticated plants and animals, but it is the primary source of food. Hunter-gatherer societies were nomadic, so people who would follow the animal herds or the seasons, the growing season, so that means that they would have to migrate to different areas. In horticultural societies, so from about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, instead of just gathering, they would grow and harvest. And this is a key point. This is where you start to see permanent settlements going up to a population. Probably the biggest around that time period would have been, you started to see even some cities that would be like 8 to 10,000 people. Most fell in that range, about 1,000 to 2,000 people. And why is that? Because there was a more stable food bank for people. As you start to get surpluses of food, population grows. And this is a key point. In horticultural societies, family starts to become more important than the group. Not that the group isn't important, but the most important thing is providing for the family than the group. Okay, pastoral societies. So pastoral societies are based on the raising and the butchering of animals. And there's some big changes that happen in pastoral societies. In pastoral societies, they are a bit more nomadic than horticultural because they follow the animals at this point. That's the big change, one of the big changes. This is where you start to see gender roles come into effect. So women remain at home, men provide the food, following, raising, butchering the livestock. But the food that they produce is mostly just for the family. And connected to that last bullet point, this is where you start to see male domination, so patriarchy. Now, you don't see defined social classes really at this point, but you start to see the beginnings of divisions between different groups of people in that society. Okay, agricultural. This is where the largest changes come. So in an agricultural society, you get systematic agriculture, and that's driven by the invention of the plow and the discovery of the use of animals as draft animals, so like mules, at times horses. So that animal power And then the plow allows them to start systematic agriculture where they can grow more food and have bigger surpluses. So that increased productivity of farming leads to the biggest surpluses yet. And when you have surpluses, people can start to specialize in new jobs because now you can have a few people who can provide the food for everybody. So that leaves time for other people to create new jobs, and that expands trade, population grows larger, huge effects from the agricultural revolution. Also, people can engage in non-economic activities. This is where we start to see school. We get more leisure time activities like sports. Government develops, and people can focus even more on religion. Government replaces family as the main organizing institution in society. So now that population has grown bigger, you need to have some type of institution that can manage the economy, can create and enforce laws, so you have justice in society. So government now is the institution that people are most dependent on to keep an orderly society. And I have that in bold because that's a really important point. Now that you have bigger surpluses, some people have more than others. So this is where we first get defined social classes. And as a result, you get higher inequality. So much different than going back to the hunter-gatherer societies where everybody is pretty much equal and everything's shared. Agricultural society, now you get those haves and have-nots. And that can lead to some problems at times in society. And that's where, as she mentioned in the video, like with Karl Marx, where some of those ideas come in that fit the conflict perspective, where some sociologists interpreted society to be governed by power and which people have power and wealth and how they deny it to other groups.